In less than 24 hours, the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party will begin. This one-week event only happens every 5 years, and the 20th edition is set to be extra special. That's because Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to be re-elected and designated as the People's Leader. Now, this title was originally given to Mao Zedong, who founded the People's Republic of China. This has led to speculation that China could finally do the unthinkable and invade Taiwan. So, in today's video, I'll tell you why this seems more likely than ever and the domino effect it could have around the world. Now, I want to start by saying that most of what's in this video is based on circumstantial evidence. Even though this evidence is compelling when it's put together, it doesn't mean necessarily that China will invade Taiwan anytime soon. That's simply because the CCP has proven over time that it plays the long game. If the CCP knows that it can take Taiwan without starting a kinetic war, then that's the route the CCP will take, regardless of how much time it takes. Note that I'm also not an expert in geopolitics. I just listen to lots of podcasts and read lots of news from a whole slew of sources. Now, funnily enough, the first bit of circumstantial evidence that China could soon invade Taiwan actually relates to the CCP strategy of playing the long game. You see, the CCP can play the long game because it's the only political party in China. That means it can implement policies that take decades to complete without having to worry about interference. There's no other political party that can be elected which will pause the policy or remove its funding or whatever else. This is in stark contrast to basically every democracy in existence. What the CCP and political parties in Western countries have in common, however, is that their highest-ranking officials are generally getting on a bit, including their leaders. In the CCP's case, Xi is 69 years old. That means that he doesn't have the luxury of playing the long game on a personal level. As much as Xi is committed to the future of the CCP, his actions have arguably proven that he's more concerned with cementing himself as the most powerful leader that China has ever seen. To my mind, taking back Taiwan would be the best way to do that, and I reckon Xi is hyper-aware of this as well. That's because being elevated to the same level as Chairman Mao within the CCP is almost certainly not enough. After all, it's a title that was also given to Mao's successor, Hua Guofeng. It doesn't really make the title that special then, because it's far from being one of a kind, and therefore could make Xi forgettable. Being labelled as the man who reunified China, however, now that's a title that would make Xi immortal within the CCP. More importantly, it's a title that nobody else would ever be able to hold, at least not unless China and Taiwan are split up and then reunited again sometime far in the future. Now, this ties in to the second bit of circumstantial evidence, and that's the fact that over the last year or so, almost every single major Western economy has announced that it will begin creating its own microchip manufacturing facilities. For context, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, manufactures most of the world's microchips and manufactures almost all the specialized chips that are used in, say, military equipment. This is basically why Taiwan is so important to the United States and its allies. It's the reason why the sudden moves by these countries to establish their own microchip manufacturing facilities are so significant. For starters, creating domestic microchip facilities means that Western countries will be less reliant on Taiwanese chips. This, in turn, will increase the likelihood that Western countries will intervene if China invades Taiwan. If Western countries don't need Taiwan's chips, then they won't have a reason to intervene militarily. This fact would increase the likelihood that China will invade Taiwan, since there's no fear of a kinetic war. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean China will invade Taiwan anytime soon. That's because it's still going to be years before all these new microchip facilities are built. Even so, it looks like they will all be complete within the decade, and at that point, China will have a clearer path to take Taiwan. Now, I talked about the Taiwanese semiconductor industry in much more detail in a previous video, which will be in the description for you. And pro tip, if TSMC stock starts to completely collapse, then chances are shit is about to hit the fan. Now, this relates to the third bit of circumstantial evidence, and that's that Taiwan is not part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This means that Western countries are under no obligation to defend the country if China attacks. Obviously, this doesn't mean that Western countries couldn't help in other ways. Ukraine isn't part of NATO either, yet it's received about as much support as NATO can give without putting actual boots on the ground. The thing is that it's not clear just how far NATO would go to defend Taiwan, especially once many of its members have set up their own microchip manufacturing facilities. Note that the United States and others are technically neutral towards Taiwan's affairs. That said, US President Joe Biden has mentioned on many occasions that the US would respond with military force, but it looks like these statements have been walked back by the White House every time. That's probably because they know that war with China over Taiwan wouldn't be worth it. Now, this pertains to the fourth bit of circumstantial evidence, and that is the ongoing war in Ukraine. There's no question that China has been watching the West's sanctions against Russia very closely. In fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest that China has been funding Russia's war in Ukraine. I mean, how else could Russia's economy survive these unprecedented sanctions? This begs the question of whether China provided these funding guarantees prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The answer must be yes, because there's no way Russia would have invaded without China's economic support. Call me crazy, but I think Putin is sane enough to have made that calculation. Now, this begs a second question, and that's what China would stand to gain by supporting Russia financially. Clearly, whatever China stands to gain must be significant, since its supporting Russia economically would result in serious scrutiny from Western countries. In fact, that's exactly what's been happening. As a wise man once said, if you want to know why something is happening, examine who benefits. In this case, there seem to be 4 big benefits for China, and all of them assist with the CCP's vision and endgame. The first benefit is unrestricted access to Ukraine. Believe it or not, but China actually has a strategic interest in Ukraine due to its Belt and Road Initiative. For those who don't know, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's global infrastructure project. When it's complete, it will run through most countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa. And this includes Ukraine. Now, the second benefit is the ability to see how the West will respond to the invasion of a significant yet non-NATO ally. To be clear, Ukraine and Taiwan are 2 different countries in 2 different situations. Even so, the response is likely to be similar, at least similar enough to allow for a meaningful analysis. Now, the third gain for China is that many Western countries have sent most, and in some cases all, their significant military equipment to Ukraine. This leaves such countries less equipped to assist with other significant conflicts should they arise, be they in Taiwan or elsewhere. The fourth gain is perhaps the most important, and that's that the West's sanctions against Russia are also doing a lot of damage to them as well. The most acute effect is inflation, which is leading to widespread discontent within these countries. In the case of Europe, most of this inflation is coming from energy and fuel shortages caused in large part by the sanctions against Russia. If these energy and fuel shortages are not addressed soon, you can bet that Europeans will be overthrowing their governments for continuing to push their green agendas. The practical effect of this is that these countries will probably not respond if China invades Taiwan. The scarier thing to consider is that these countries may not even respond if Russia launches a counter-offensive against Ukraine in the dead of winter. Let's not go there. This brings me to the fifth bit of circumstantial evidence, and that's the United States. The US midterm elections will happen in about a month's time, and it's believed that they're going to be the most contentious set of elections to date. Case in point, Bill Gates recently said that, quote, "We're going to have a hung election and a civil war." Straight up, That's what he said. One side will disagree with the outcome regardless, and people will take to the streets and start fighting each other. And Bill isn't just making this stuff up either. Polls show that most American voters believe there is a high chance of a civil war. This is true regardless of political affiliation. More than a third of American voters also believe that it's time for the country to be split up into blue states and red states. That is some extreme polarization, and all the inflation that Americans are experiencing is probably making things worse. When people don't have enough money to pay for rent or food, riots tend to be the outcome. I reckon the midterms could provide the perfect spark for these riots. As with Europe, a domestic crisis of confidence in the United States means it will be much less likely to intervene if China invades Taiwan. Some would say that war tends to be a great unifier, but I would say that in today's information age, people know which wars are worth fighting. It turns out most aren't. Now, if I'm wrong, and the United States does somehow rally its citizens around going to war with China, then it could be presented with a second issue, and that's the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. If you watched our recent video about the SPR, you'll know it's at its lowest level since 1984. That's because the current administration has been dumping the SPR into the domestic economy to keep inflation and petrol prices in the United States low. The SPR has been draining fast, and OPEC's recent decision to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day will only cause it to drain even faster. Given that the SPR is intended for emergencies, such as a war, the United States might not have the energy resources it needs to defend Taiwan if China invades. You can have the most powerful military in the world, but if you have no fuel for all your jets and ships, then you don't really have a military at all. Now, to be honest, I actually don't know how important the SPR is for the US military's operations. Based on my research, the US military only uses around 250,000 barrels of oil per day. This means that the United States should theoretically have the capacity to supply its military even without the SPR. One thing is for sure though, and that's that the SPR being at a multi-year low is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's unlikely that the United States will be in such a vulnerable position energy-wise ever again. You can bet this is something the CCP is hyper-aware of. Oh, and did you know that before and during the Ukrainian invasion, the Chinese have been filling up their strategic reserves with a lot of Russian oil? Speaking of interesting energy issues, the sixth bit of circumstantial evidence relates to China's pandemic policy, its peculiar actions during the pandemic, its economic situation, and its demographics. A lot to break down here, so bear with me. As many of you will know, China has had a strict zero-COVID policy since the start of the pandemic. Now, there are many theories as to why this is. One is that the CCP wants to prove it can handle a pandemic better than the West. This theory is questionable given China could very easily fudge the numbers. That's why the theory that the CCP wants to cause inflation in the West by locking down its supply chains has been the more popular one over the last year. From what I've seen and heard, it's been taken as a fact among macro analysts at this point. Still, maybe the CCP really just is that crazy. The thing about these theories is that they're not mutually exclusive, and I reckon there's some truth to both. It's also true that the CCP cannot continue its zero-COVID policy indefinitely. At some point, it will have to stop, and there's speculation that this will happen during or after the 20th CCP Congress. Once this happens, then all of China's manufacturing will come back online. This will create a surge in oil demand at a time when there are energy shortages around the world. Recall that OPEC just cut its output, and Europe is already running dangerously low on oil and gas. Logically, this will only add to inflation. On the flip side, there are many who believe that China is intent on continuing its zero-pandemic policy indefinitely. Their evidence for this is that China continues to build isolation facilities and continues stockpiling record levels of food, which is also adding to inflation around the world. But what if these isolation facilities are not intended for those who test positive in the future? And what if the primary purpose of stockpiling all this food isn't to cause inflation? Without the pandemic, these actions look like a country that's preparing for a serious war. Prisons for dissenters, food for the army. Then there's the economic element. In case you missed the memo, China's economy is kind of in the toilet. Its housing market is falling apart, people are getting locked out of their bank accounts, institutions aren't investing, and those pandemic restrictions are doing serious economic damage as well. If you watched one of our older videos about how to prepare for a bear market, you might recall that one of the ways to get out of a crappy economic situation is to start a war. What's annoying is that only the CCP knows whether China's economic situation is bad enough to justify this kind of solution. What we do know is that China has at least 35 million more extra men than women. This is because of China's infamous one-child policy, which resulted in families choosing to have boys over girls. China's gender imbalance has since become a big problem, and it's going to become an even bigger problem. That's because young and middle-aged men tend to be the ones who start riots and revolutions. With the CCP constantly on a shaky footing, having such a large portion of the population that's willing and able to fight is not ideal. An easy way to get rid of all these men would be to send them all to war. On that note, the seventh bit of circumstantial evidence relates to what would happen between other countries if China invaded Taiwan. While China has a large number of extra men, it's actually in second place. The first-place country in this contest is India, with over 55 million more extra men. As it so happens, India has some territorial disputes of its own. Although the most well-known of these involve Pakistan, India actually has a few territorial disputes with China as well. The idea that India would make a move in the southeast could be a part of why the CCP hasn't moved on Taiwan just yet. It's not just China or India either. There are dozens of countries with disputed territories. All these countries are facing their own sets of internal issues that their politicians know they could solve by going to war with their enemies next door. The only thing stopping them is the world police, aka the West. But, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Europe is more or less guaranteed to be in crisis, and it's more than likely that the United States will experience some internal strife in the next month or so. Does this mean we will see more territorial conflicts emerge? Possibly, but that would be guaranteed if China invades Taiwan. That's because all the other countries with disputed territories will know, or rather assume, that the United States will focus its military attention on Taiwan if China invades. As such, it will make it the perfect time for all these countries to go to war with their neighbors. Now, the reason I say assume is because there's a very real possibility the United States would focus its military attention on another ally if all hell breaks loose. Israel is the elephant in the room, and it looks like the US intelligence agencies are already at work to undermine Iran so that it doesn't attack Israel. That's because the US military knows damn well that it would not be a world war where it's East versus West. It'll be a series of long-held territorial disputes evolving into kinetic war. That's just because the information age has once again made this kind of two-sided global war impossible. Going to war against a hated neighbor, however, that's still possible in the information age, and that's what the next world war will look like. The question is, which hat will be the first to drop? Will it be China versus Taiwan? Or will there be another significant conflict that comes first to light the spark? To my mind, it's only a matter of time before one of these sparks comes around. China versus Taiwan will then be one of many conflicts, and there will be no way for anyone to stop them all. What happens after that is anyone's guess. For what it's worth, we probably won't see many, if any, nukes get used in local conflicts. In sum then, it's arguably not a question of if China invades Taiwan, but when. Circumstances are about as favourable as they could be for the CCP. The next few weeks will present the perfect opportunity to take advantage of these circumstances, as most of them will be reaching their apex. For Xi, it will be the only opportunity. And that's all for today's video on why China might well be about to invade Taiwan. If you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them. Please drop a comment down below. If you thought my analysis was on point, smash that like button to give me a point. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next one, subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. While you wait, you can check out Coin Bureau clips for crypto flicks and tune in to the Coin Bureau podcast to learn about the crypto past. You can also follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for memes and behind the scenes, and join my Telegram channel for daily crypto updates that will keep you up to speed. If you're wondering what I think comes next for the crypto market, you can get my forward guidance by subscribing to my weekly newsletter. And if you want to support the channel, check out the Coin Bureau merch store for quality crypto apparel that will make your crypto friends jealous. You can find your way there and to all the other resources I just mentioned using the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching and take care out there. See you next time.